Hello and welcome. My name is Ginger Fay and I'm with Apple Youth Education, and we are thrilled for you to join us for today's conversation in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month here in May, talking about school and mental health and how we can support our teens and tweens. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart as a parent of two teenagers, and I'm joined today by two amazing professionals in this space who are going to answer all of our questions in the next hour, and we're going to have all of our problems solved, right, guys?
Yep.
So Sylvette Bullard is the upper learning counselor at the Galloway School in Atlanta, Georgia. And she has wonderful experience on the school side of things, how to help parents communicate with their school and navigate these waters of the teen and tween years. And Dr. Kimberly Vey, who is a DBT Linehan Board certified clinician, and she's president of the Linehan Board right now, and she's in private practice as a therapist in Atlanta as well. So Kim and Sylvette, thank you so much for being with us. I made a little slide so folks would know your background and your good work, and we're grateful to have you here. Today's conversation is literally that, a conversation. So this is an opportunity for folks to put their questions, their concerns into the Q&A box, and we're going to try and cover as many different topics as we can in the next hour. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Apple Youth and why we do what we do and why we're doing a program like this one. We believe fundamentally that if you can change a student's self-belief, then you can change what's possible for them. If they believe in themselves, then what they can do can shine. We work with students in 3 different ways. We help students with academic tutoring from elementary school through college. We help students with high stakes standardized test prep. So whether they're applying to K-12 schools and taking something like the SSAT, applying to college and giving the ACT or SAT a try, or going to grad school and working on the GRE, we're glad to be a partner in that process. We also work with students on executive function support, which can be a really good way for students to build the skills that they need to do the work. So if we can be of help to you, I hope you'll reach out to Apple Youth. We're always glad to be of help and support to you and your students. We're going to answer a lot of questions today, I hope, and we have several that have already come in, but I do want to ask you all, our audience, a couple of questions, if I may. So we're going to launch a quick poll just to get a sense of who's with us today. Are you a student, parent, or an educator? And then where is your student in this process? And is there a way that we can be helpful to you as you are on this journey as students and parents? So if we can be of help, as I mentioned, executive function coaching is one of the things we do, and a great way to kind of find out if that's a good first step is to do a mind print assessment. We're glad to do that with you if we can. Otherwise, we're going to jump into questions, and we don't need to look at this box. I just want to look at your faces. So thank you both again for being with us, Sylvette and Kim. I have a tremendous amount of respect for both of you and the great work that you do with students and families. And I'm so grateful that we can share that with a wider audience today. So I'm grateful for everyone tuning in. So I wanted to start with I guess a few questions, and then, as I say, we're going to be engaging with the audience and taking their questions as well. Can we talk just a little bit? This is the end of the school year for a lot of families, and this is a time when lots of people are looking towards next year. They're sort of doing some assessments about how this year went, and then kind of thinking a little bit about next year. How can families help a student find the right balance between support and challenge? There are some families who think we've got to take every advanced course. That's what we hear when we visit the colleges. We have to have rigor in our curriculum. And then we also hear that students are struggling with mental health, and anxiety and depression is really rampant in this generation. And Kim, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, I know. But how do we balance sort of trying to be supportive and not overloading a student with helping them see what they're capable of and being ready for the next steps? So Kim, would you start speaking to that from your perspective? And then Sylvette, if you could talk a little bit about it on the school side, I'd be grateful.
From a mental health perspective and the sort of the anxiety that comes with transitions, and that come also with the what decisions do we make, right? We're hearing this from schools, we're hearing this from my parents are saying this, the school's saying this, or they've got all this information overload. And so it's really like slowing down, right? Like for the parent to just slow down and be open to hearing all sides, and then deter, like, your child the best, right? Like you and your child, like what the school is saying, what college is saying, that is a statement. It doesn't necessarily mean it's truth for your child. And it may be truth for your child, right? And like, so allowing yourself to explore it as opposed to making those statements the truth. And then acknowledging, a lot of the questions, and a lot of the things that we're going to talk about deal with anxiety, and even validating and how we can talk to our students and our children. But it's looking at how do we acknowledge where they're at and see where we need to go, right? Like, as opposed to dismissing sort of the anxiety. I mean, as adults, moving into new jobs is anxiety provoking, right? Like there's so many different anxiety provoking things that we take for granted that we work through, but we also need to allow our children to work through them. And sort of stepping back and seeing all sides, as opposed to sort of latching onto one side and sort of making that fit your child, right? Because whether they're not an all AP student or they are an all AP student, right? Like it's like not making either side fit, and just slowing. I would say the biggest advice is like slowing down and recognizing this is anxiety provoking for everybody, right? And like owning it. Like it's not, it would be odd if it wasn't anxiety provoking on some level, right? Like, and so owning the human side of it.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I have the thought of sort of meeting your child where they are and going from there. And so, and that may vary when you start to add in those extra layers of anxiety or stress or worry. And not to mention, the anxiety or stress that you as a parent are also carrying, right? And so you've got hopes and dreams and expectations. And so really trying to balance your own expectations with what is presenting with your child is really important. And I think having that communication and conversation, which is something we're also going to dig into with your child, is really important, along with just having that information from the school, be it, what exactly is involved with the course. There's just some information that is readily available. And I think sometimes we try to figure things out on our own, but really working with the school to find out, are there free periods available, or what can we do to sort of balance out, a super heavy course load with maybe some lighter electives, or, sort of really leaning into what the student is interested in and what their strengths are, and allowing those to really flourish. Also sort of exploring the possibility of maybe later, you may not have to do or need to do everything right now, that you've got, a 4-year, you're looking at a 4-year plan. And so also sort of looking at that in terms of that challenge versus the support. But I think the main thing is really sort of meeting your child where they are, because once life happens, it affects their ability to think and produce and do work that they may have the better potential to do when they're not in a situation where they're really stressed or dealing with anxiety. And then there are always, speaking of life, there are things that happen. Unfortunately, we may have a loss of a loved one, or we may have another crisis that comes into play. And so I think, again, sort of allowing all those things to help also help your student know that life happens, and that we have to adjust to those things, and that we can overcome those challenges, when it's important to not just to focus on the schoolwork or just the academic or just the grades, but to allow life to happen and to make those adjustments as necessary. We also often tell our students, in terms of the college piece, our college counselors always say, if something happens, something happens in your life and it changes the trajectory, or it changes the semester, there's always a space in your application to indicate, this happened in my life, and this is what happened, and this is how it may have affected this grade, or may have affected this part of my life. And it allows the student and also the counselor to the college counselor to work together to really explore that and expound on that and allow the colleges to understand, I'm three-dimensional here. I'm not just, a student who goes to school and everything goes well. There are things that happen. And so I would just encourage any family that has had something to happen to know that there's a space on the college application to explain that and to allow the colleges to know what's going on.
I would just
Thanks
add
so
one other
Great.
piece to that too, is that, and I think so what you mentioned this briefly, is that not to assume that everything is very rigid, right? And Sylvette and I have had conversations over the years too of, I'll have a client say, no, but it's this way. I have to do X, Y, and Z. And I was like, well, let's check, right? Like, and so there is, maybe there is a free period, or maybe there is, and so that things aren't always just as rigid as they may look on paper, and having conversations and being able to be, more open and vulnerable to see what options there are. And just with that communication, recognizing that we're transactional, right? Like I'm playing off of Sylvette right now and she's playing off of me, right? Like we affect each other. And so it's the same way in a relationship, right? Like your anxiety, your stress is going to influence your child and vice versa. So we're not isolated in this process. There's always a transactional effect.
That's a great point, Kim. I do think that a lot of middle and high school students are still very concrete reasoners. And so they just kind of see things in black and white, and there's beauty and clarity in that. But it can also make for difficult problem solving skills. And so when they learn how to ask for help and have flexibility in what help might look like, right? It's not necessarily an all or nothing thing. It's not drop this class. It's maybe get an extension on that one paper that you're struggling with, things like that, to find that flexibility. I think that's really key. Kim, you said something about how we play off each other. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about anxiety. We throw that word around a lot these days. And so I want to ask two things. One is, do we know more, or is there more? I've been working in education and schools for really longer than I want to admit, more than 25 years. And I've seen what feels like a dramatic uptick in the anxiety level of high school students in particular. And I wonder, do we know more about it, or is it happening more, or is it a combination of those things? And then maybe some tips from both of you about what to do when anxiety is heightening for everyone, right? Because as you were just saying, Kim, like we play off each other, and of all diseases, anxiety seems to be one of the most contagious, right? If someone else is worried about something, then I am, if I'm empathic, I'm embracing their worry. If it's a child that I love, I'm feeling it at a much heightened level. So kind of, if we can have maybe a little conversation about the big picture piece of anxiety, and then also just how we can help manage it in our homes, in our schools, and with our students.
So in the first part of that, is anxiety on the rise, or are we just more aware of it? I think it's a both and. I think the stigma is being debunked with celebrities and professional athletes, and there's more open communication about it, which then makes it seem less like a flaw or less of a weakness for others to be able to communicate their anxiety. And so I think that's one part of it. And the other part of it, where I do believe it's on the rise, is if you think even the three of us, right? Like we grew up communicating with people. We grew up interfacing with people. And so if I wanted to talk to a friend in middle school or high school, I had to talk to the friend, right? Like maybe I would call them on the phone, but really I had to stand in front of them and have a conversation. Or if I wanted to communicate with a teacher, I had to go into the classroom and look at the teacher and communicate with the teacher. And now so much can be done behind a screen, right? And so we can easily sit behind a screen because we've already learned to interface, right? We've already built up resilience to being able to have that difficult conversation, or a conversation that is perceived as difficult, right? Like, oh, that teacher is going to be mad at me if I have to tell them that I don't have my assignment done. So let me just email them, right? Like there's a little bit of anxiety there, but that's not true anxiety. that is really a hidden, right? Like you're behind a curtain. And so if we just think about the way that things have shifted over the years in how technology and screens have become a way of communicating, it really prevents resilience from being built, because now there's very little interfacing. If I want to break up with a partner, I might send them a text, or I might, chat them on Snapchat or something, right? Like there's so many in there, even the new social media apps, they're anxiety provoking, right? Like with Snapchat of streaks, like imagine being a youth, like the three of us, and thinking like, I have to keep this streak going. I can't lose my phone. If I lose my phone, then I'm going to lose it. Like that's just so much anxiety that is just inherently sort of baked into the environment right now. That is, I think that's where the rise is coming, because the resilience isn't necessarily being built the way that it was when our generation was growing up.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, to your point, and I'm gonna say, you're probably gonna hear me say this a lot, but sort of meeting them where they are, like I might say, okay, reach out to your teacher, but no, I have to take it a few steps back and say, okay, this is what reaching out to your teacher looks like, and this is what it means, and this is how we can do it. And I've sat with students and I have helped craft emails, and I have help them go through a script or the beginning of a conversation with their teacher. And so just, again, meeting them where they are and then helping them sort of stretch and grow in that capacity, in terms of that direct communication, is a huge piece of what I'm seeing on the school front. And also definitely seeing more of the anxiety, I think, to the point where, sometimes we do have to distinguish between I'm feeling anxious and I have this diagnosis, because at some point or another, we're all feeling anxious, but that isn't necessarily a diagnosis. And so I think helping us sort of understand that discrepancy is important. But yes, definitely, some things in terms of focusing on what we can control, and sitting down and actually listing some of those things is often really helpful, because when that anxiousness comes into play, or that nervousness, or that avoidance as a response to that anxiety comes in, then it's sort of just sitting and grounding them with, okay, this is what reality, this is what's really happening, and this is how we can use that reality to move forward, to some of the many amazing DBT skills. And so I think it just sort of ranges from simple things like, again, sort of having a conversation and talking about what we can control and what the reality is, and how the teacher who you've been avoiding really is trying to help you and really is on your side, and how to have that conversation, to some of the more therapy based reduction of anxiety. And that's, again, where I've worked with Kim over the years, and just, if we have students who are in therapy, and regardless of if the student is or does not have a therapist, often that teamwork is really important in finding ways that we can bridge what's happening either at home or at school, here on campus, to help support them as well.
Thanks.
And humanizing.
Go ahead, Kim.
Well, and humanizing that anxiety, right? Like, because I think, to your point, Sylvette, of is this a diagnosis, right? Like if it's a diagnosis, that means not everybody has it, right? If it's a disorder, then not everybody has it, versus everybody has anxiety. Like anxiety is what keeps us safe. It's just a matter of the perception, and oftentimes it's the anticipatory anxiety that actually is the problem, because it prevents us, because we're anticipating something. And just for parents and educators, to first acknowledge that it's making them anxious, whether there's truth behind it or not, right? Like sometimes the more we can just acknowledge that, the less it can decrease it a little bit, to be able to go into problem solving and recognize that that problem solving is not possible in all scenarios when anxiety is at its highest. And so recognizing the anxiety, and again, slowing down, meeting them where they're at, right? And just saying, okay, so it sounds like this is really creating a lot of anxiety. Let's sort of put a pin in it, and we'll come back to it, and that's okay. And so it's the more that we can normalize that anxiety is a part of the human makeup, and it's part of being human, the more that it can make them feel like there's something wrong with me because I'm anxious about going into the 9th grade into a new school, right? Like I said to kids, like, I would be concerned if you weren't, right? Like I would think there was something going on if you weren't anxious. So the normalizing piece of it is really important.
Thank you both. Kim, and so that one of the things that I have heard both of you talk about before is pre-coping and cope ahead. And so that you just had talked about kind of basically rehearsing a difficult conversation you're going to have with a teacher. I can't think of anything in my entire life that I've gotten worse at by doing it more than once. Almost everything, right? We do better when we've tried it more than once. I mean, that first batch of chocolate chip cookies, I mean, they weren't terrible, but they're much better now than they were some years ago when I started trying. So I know we mentioned earlier that Kim, that you're a practitioner of DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that practice and what are some of the skills that you encourage patients of yours to practice that are things that we can all use in our personal lives and that students could use at school.
Yeah. So in DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, it really is it's cognitive therapy. It's a cognitive therapy base, and it is a behavioral treatment though. And so it's a lot around skills application, skills generalization, and applicable skills to get to that neuroplasticity of changing actually the way that our brain is operating in moments of stress. And so I'll start with the cope ahead that you just mentioned. When we can do a cope ahead, which is really important for the schools of being able to talk through those conversations and sort of a little bit of the what ifs, not the catastrophizing or the worst case scenarios necessarily, but okay, so I'm going to go in front of this teacher. I'm going to feel anxious. What am I going to do when I feel anxious? It cuts off the slap in the face when the anxiety hits. Sort of like, I know what to do if it happens. It's like if you have asthma and you carry around an inhaler, you might feel more at ease because you know you have something if you need it, right? And so knowing that you have something as opposed to one thing we call apparent competences where it's, I got this, it's going to be fine, right? I truly believe it's going to be fine. And let's just talk about when the anxiety hits, right? Because when the anxiety hits, everything we know goes out the window. And so it's helpful to have that idea of like, okay, it's highly likely that having to let, Sylvette know I didn't do my final project is going to bring up anxiety. So what am I going to do when I get that body sensation? Right. And so it's sort of coping ahead for what that looks like. There is one skill in DBT that really addresses, it's the mammal reflex, the dive reflex. It's called the tip skill. And I know I've talked to Sylvette and a lot of pretty much everybody that I've communicated with my clients of anxiety, because it's one of the only skills that actually targets the physiological response to anxiety, right? There are a lot of distract skills. There are a lot of different things that we can do to distract ourselves. And if the physiological response to the anxiety is so high, those things aren't necessarily going to work. And so essentially it's temperature change. You just put ice pack on your forehead and bend over, hold your breath for 20 to 30 seconds. 30 seconds sounds like a really long time for me. So like 20 to 30 seconds, and then come up and you repeat that about 3 times. And then there's an intense exercise piece to get your heart rate up, progressive muscle relaxation, and pace breathing. And when you go through that, all 4 parts, or just even the ice pack part, to bring down the ice actually decreases your blood pressure, lowers your heart rate, and actually calms the nervous system. And so I have a lot of my patients have the breakable ice packs, like the first aid kit ice packs that they carry in their bag or their purse. And so either they can do it in the nurse's office, or even if they have to go into the bathroom and they do it real quick. Even I have some patients who have them in their room just because they freeze, right? Like when anxiety really hits. And so it's just addressing that sort of the physiological response to the anxiety that sort of shuts us down, and that fight or flight response kicks in.
So
I know, so that you guys have implemented a lot of skills too, just like how you've interwoven them into the school system.
Yeah, I mean, we embrace and welcome our, welcome students to be able to do tip skills or to do different things if it's kind of stepping outside of class or taking a walk or and I think this is sort of where that parent advocacy comes into play if a school sort of pushes back on certain things. Our school is very welcoming to knowing more about what we can do to support students in terms of being able to reduce their anxiety, and it's different things work for different students, and so so we're definitely supportive of that. And I think that practice piece is also really important that you mentioned. And I tell students, I say, it feels weird because you're not in that like space to need it, but promise me when, and I often will compare it to like being an athlete or a musician or practicing or studying for a test, when you're in that like buzzer moment or you're in, you're on stage, you want to have rehearsed it, you want to have it practiced because you're going to be nervous or stressed, and those things could derail you if you haven't been prepared. And so it's important that you start to practice those skills and practice the things that can center you and work for you as you are getting through that. Whoops. That stressful period, as I knocked my water over. A little stress there, but it's all right. As you get through that stressful period and to help kind of steer you. And I think kind of going back to the communication with the school, the more that we are aware of, the better. I think sometimes families feel anxious about sharing or disclosing problems or struggles that families or students are having. And I think it's important and helpful for us to be aware so that we can at least be informed and sort of know what's happening and know what to expect, so that if there is a school environment that doesn't really embrace a child getting up and maybe taking a break, then that communication can happen and they can be allowed to do that.
Thank you both so much. I was just thinking as you were saying that, Sylvette, I was like, if you're afraid to talk to your school about your student, like as a whole person, it might be a sign that this might not be the right school for your student, right? Because you can't, maybe you can't change your kid, but you could change their environment. I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit about how you might know that it's time to make a change, and how to make a change if that is warranted, right? How do you know that you can or should be looking around at other options? Should you look at charter schools? Should you look at homeschooling? Is independent school a possibility? Would boarding school even be an option in terms of the student being out of an environment, a peer group maybe that's been challenging? So what are some of the kind of signals that it might be time to think about a change? And then how do we navigate changes? I'm just thinking about this is a pivotal time of year, right? We've got students who are graduating or finishing a division or even just finishing a grade. And so thinking about that, that those are good moments, right? Looking forward to summer is always, has a good feeling, but it's also then what's next and what's on the other side. And that can be anxiety producing for us too. So if you could talk about both sides of that coin, I think that would be really helpful.
I would say that, again, as a parent, you're the expert on your child. And so you're going to have, I would say, trust your senses. So if you sense that, if it's an academic issue, a social emotional issue, a social peer issue, I mean, there are all kinds of different things that can happen in the course of a school year. And I think also communicating with your child is very important to get feedback and input from them, getting feedback and input from the school. And I think having that open communication. And I think, so just sort of tracking it, I can't get into specifics because every situation would be different, but I think if you're having an issue and it's not resolved and you've tried, or the school has tried, or your child has tried and it's not getting resolved, I think those are indicators. That would be an indicator that maybe a change is on the horizon. I think the other thing to really keep in mind is that often we have this idea of the dream school for our child. And sometimes we try to fit, I often will say, you try to fit a square peg into a round hole and it doesn't fit. And so you are it's not that something is wrong with your child, and it's not that something is wrong with the school. It's just that you don't fit each other's needs, and that's okay. And I think sort of being transparent and putting that out there, if you're getting to the point where it's just not a good fit, that's okay. If you do engage on a school search or start looking at a different educational environment, I always say, parents, you're in the driver's seat, your child is in the driver's seat, and you're interviewing the school as much as they're interviewing you. And to really look for the fit. It's about fit. It's about your child being supported and challenged in the different ways that they need to be to grow. And so just kind of go and feeling empowered. I would say feeling empowered if you're having to switch a school, and knowing, you know, this is my child and this is what we're bringing to the table, and what do you have that can help support them and make them grow into the person that they're going to be. But definitely, I think we definitely get warning signs. I would venture to say that, you know, if we get to the point where a family's having a conversation about changing schools, it's not a surprise. And so I think it's just important that everyone is aware and also tries to problem solve before getting to that point. But if you get to the point where you have to switch, then feel empowered and know that you're making the right choice for your family.
And I would add a bit of I guess, to piggyback and a little bit of a different perspective. Also, what I say to parents too is look at concrete situations where it's very easy to say, like, Galloway is not the right fit because of X, Y, and Z, but the school that you're looking at has X, Y, and Z, right? It just maybe feels different. And so really in the initial phases, looking at it concretely, like maybe Galloway has, you know, a larger class size and somebody else has a smaller class size. Like, that's a very concrete difference, because it's very easy to just, you know, think that, you know, sort of that the grass is greener on the other side at times. And so taking some emotions out of it at the beginning and just looking at it concretely to see, like, you know, because as parents, we just want our child to be in the best environment. And if in this moment this doesn't feel like the best environment, then this one must be, right? And so looking at, like, what tools does the child need to be successful in the next environment, because some of that, the same things may be present, they just may look differently, or they may, you know, teachers are still going to have expectations, there's still going to be deadlines, there's still, you know. But I think one warning sign that I see is, you know, if I reach out to a school, which thankfully here in Atlanta, I have not had this experience, but if I was to reach out to a school and they would not want to collaborate, or they would not want to really have any communication around, like, the mental health side of things, then that is something to explore, because that is a part of us right now, right? Like, that is a part of society right now that can't be ignored. And so if there is a school that says, you know, they just need to figure it out, they need to work through it, and right, like, but as adults, I mean, so that's probably using some skills now because she spilled her water, right? Like, we don't just work through it, like, we do stuff to work through it. And so we can't expect our kid to just work through it. And so I think that's one sign to explore. And like I said, thankfully we have not had that experience here, but I've heard that there are, it's like, no, we're teaching them to be independent, or we're teaching them to work through it. We need tools to work through it, right? And so but really looking at the concrete differences that what are you trying to save your child from versus what is a better fit, right? Because oftentimes when we're trying to save them from something, that thing, it might be where we're trying to move them to, right? And so if we're not building them up and giving them tools, we're just sort of delaying it from happening in the next setting. And so also exploring, like, why are we making this change? Like, what tools do we as a family versus, you know, and our child, what tools do we need to be able to better navigate the change or the situation?
I was going to say, I just also want to add that, you know, challenges and problems are an opportunity to grow, and not all challenges and problems are a reason to leave. You can definitely work through them and come out even stronger on the other side. So I would also say just really examine that part as well. Just because it feels uncomfortable or it's a difficult space to be in doesn't mean that it's the wrong space. It's just something that needs to be worked through. And often if you're in a school environment where you're successfully able to work through the problem, it can actually help strengthen the community and connection between you and the school.
Great points all. I've got, we've gotten 2 questions about communication that I wanted to pose to you all. One is, what is the best way to communicate with the school when you have a worry about your child or some important information to share about what they're going through? So Sylvette, as a school counselor, like how should parents approach that conversation? Who should they reach out to and how?
So I would say, there are a variety of different concerns and worries that parents may have about their child. I would say, of course, I'm going to speak from my lens and say I'm a great catch-all. So I don't teach necessarily. I'm not administration necessarily. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. And so if I'm able to help support the problem and problem solve, I will. And if not, I know who to direct you to. And so I think I'm a good space to start, or your school counselor in your schools, in your child's school is a good place to start. If it's something, it could be something that's really grounded in the academic piece. It could be something that's a combination. I will say that typically it may feel completely academic. It typically will also involve some social emotional as well. And so if on the face of it, it feels academic and you talk with the counselor about it, they can typically be able to help you see the fuller picture. So I think starting with the school counselor, setting up a time to talk or meet in person. Email is great. I often, depending on the topic, I always like to pick up the phone and really have a conversation because it's just easier to have a back and forth. And so parents, if you're trying to decide if I should send a quick email, maybe it could be an email that says, hey, I would like to schedule a time to talk and, set up a time, because again, it feels like it may take more time to do the phone call, but it typically is more, it's more effective, particularly when you're trying to learn and you're trying to share your concern about your child. And then it could go from there to setting up a time with the teacher or setting up a time with administration. It just really varies from there, but I would say a counselor is a good starting point. But again, I am speaking from the counselor's point of view. I'm here to help and sort of direct and point them in the right direction.
That seems
And
like
I often tell clients too, like, again, going to the point of meeting them where they're at, is who in the school do you feel most comfortable with? And then go, and oftentimes I'll hear, but they don't deal with that, right? Like, it's my math teacher. Well, my math teacher, they can't help me. No, but they can help support you in going to the person that can help you. And so sort of moving out of that space that, it has to be that one person, or, and I think in Sylvette's case, because just tooting the horn of Galloway, like the counseling department is very open, right? Like, and that may not be always the case. And so, or we may feel like they're open, but for some reason the child doesn't feel that way. And so let's not make the child feel that way, right? Like, help them navigate that, to see that that person is open, and we may have to get support in getting there. And so if your child has somebody that they really connect with, whether it's a parapro or a teacher or, whoever in the school to start with, to then sort of help navigate the conversation to get to the right person, can feel empowering. And it's like, I'm heard, right? Like, I don't have to just, I'm not pigeonholed necessarily.
I would piggyback on what you said, Kim. I think I agree. Just whoever you have that connection to at the school. I would also say to follow up, because some things happen, life happens, and sometimes there may be a delay in their response, or they may have, anything could happen. And so I would always encourage, if you haven't heard back, just follow up, and just follow up to make sure that you're able to get that communication started. It doesn't mean that something bad has happened just because you haven't heard back, but it is always good to sort of follow up if you haven't heard back. I would also say, depending on the age of your child, to include your child in that conversation if they're at all able to be a part of that. Not necessarily the talk that you have with that person, that trusted person, but that they're aware that it's happening. just so that they're also learning self-advocacy skills, and they're learning those communication skills as well, to know that, you know, you have their best interests at heart, and that you're aware, and that you're speaking with their voice and with their wants and desires in mind as well.
That's great advice, Sylvette. I really appreciate it. I sometimes try to just do my thinking out loud around my children so that they can see that I'm working through a problem. I've been on the planet longer than they have, so I have a few things that I've practiced a few times and tricks up my sleeve. But I want them to see that, like, I'm thinking about who I know and how I can communicate with them and what would be effective, to model that. Even before they might be ready to necessarily do it themselves, but so that they will be when they're armed to do that. The other question we had around communication is about how to get your child to open up about how school is going. I think many parents can relate to sitting in the front of a car and asking the back of the car, how was your day? And not getting a lot of information. Kim, you do a great job of pulling information out of students, so that I know you do too. So any tips you have for how to get students to open up about how they're doing, whether it's good or bad, right? Parents want to hear that news.
First, I say this to all my parents, like, what works for me is not going to work for you because I don't have the emotional tie, right? And so a lot of parents feel like, wait, they said that they opened up to you? Like, they would never say, they absolutely would never say that to you, because I'm not their parent. I don't have to, see them through the halls of the house every day. So I would say the first bit of advice is to just recognize that there is oftentimes sensory overload, right? Like, whether it's academic, social, whatever it is, sometimes they just need a little bit of space. And I know for parents that have had children with higher risk behaviors, or behaviors that have been scary in the past, that is very anxiety provoking for the parent to have silence, right? Because your mind goes to, uh-oh, what happened? What's going to happen? That all makes total sense. And so to check in with yourself of, am I projecting something here, or does my kid just need help? It just needs some space. I think it's like, we go home from work and we may not want to jump into a conversation about work, right? And so recognizing that the child may need a little bit of space, and having conversations that aren't targeted necessarily and emotionally driven of, what went well today, or what went, that just may feel overwhelming. And so just being willing to have general conversations, and they don't all have to have a specific purpose, right? That's that transactional effect too, right? Sometimes we can just talk about innocuous things, and it just decreases everybody's anxiety, but it has no purpose to the conversation, right? Like, the conversation really has no substance, but it just is a conversation, and everything doesn't have to have this emotional charge behind it.
And I totally agree. I think to piggyback on what you're saying, I jokingly, but quite seriously, also say it's like a portal, like the Star Trek portal, like you have to run through when it's open. And so sometimes you just have to find that space where they're available. And like you said, when they're first getting in the car, they're first getting home, often they just want to just chill, they want that space to just sort of decompress. And often we're wanting to know, kind of how, as a parent, you're wanting to know, like, how was your day? And you're like ready, and, having 1,000,001 questions, especially if you've already heard a little bit about what may have happened. And so I think just giving them that space and giving them that time. And I think what you'd also mentioned about sort of thinking out loud and almost making it like an on-level conversation, and not the parent asking their child these questions and it becoming sort of like an interrogation, but just saying, just being transparent in terms of your thoughts, or maybe some of your worry or some of your concerns. And I just really want to make sure that you're okay. And then, sometimes that will help them feel like, okay, I'm not going to get in trouble, or I'm not being interrogated. I just they just want to know how I'm doing and want to know what's happening. But I do think, giving them the space and time is important. And also just sort of the tone and approach in it being something that feels more like, oh, they're thinking about me and they think that something might be going on. And if not, it's okay. But I just kind of want to talk with you about what's happening.
And even outside of the moment, outside of the situation of them getting in the car, just getting home from school, having a conversation of just giving them a little bit of agency to have a say in what it looks like of, I recognize that, when you're at the end of the day, you seem, really maybe overwhelmed or stressed, sometimes they'll say, don't tell me how I'm feeling. If that's what works for me, it doesn't really work for parents. But to sort of see where, and then say like, what would work, right? Like, I get it. You don't like after school is not the time to talk. Like, could we have conversation for a few minutes after dinner or right? Like just having more of a dialogue and a open conversation around like what would work and not saying, will you talk to me? They'll probably say no. Right? Like, because again, it's that parent child, right? I'm the parent, you're the child, we're going to have this conversation versus, hey, I want something, you want something, like, how do we sort of come to the middle and figure out what's going to work for both of us? Because this isn't just an insulated process.
I love that. I wish I had had you guys telling me what to do when I was torturing inadvertently an introverted 6-year-old, because I am very extroverted and I have a very introverted child. And it took a while for us to figure out how we could communicate and navigate together. We love each other very much, but we don't we don't get our energy in the same way. One of the things I learned recently is that there could be a blood sugar issue as well. When school lunches are always fantastic. I mean, nobody ever talks about anything else but how delicious they are, right? So if school lunch hasn't been so hot and a student hasn't necessarily had a great kind of replenishment in the middle of the day, they might come home depleted in more ways than one. So I've actually learned to ask, what was for lunch today? Which is not a personal question, like an attack question. And then I know if they hated it, that I need to get some peanut butter in that kid pretty quick, because we're running low on protein. So that's just a tip that I've learned as a parent that I'm happy to share, and maybe save people a few of those tough moments after school. I don't know if this is a question that we got coming in, and I don't know if this takes us too far off track, but I'm going to ask it. I have a peer, a parent of a friend of my child's who is overstepping into my child's social life. How do I navigate that conversation? You're kind of co-parenting with a peer group inadvertently. And if you find that you're kind of in conflict with some of your child's friends' parents, do you have any suggestions for how to navigate that conversation, not wanting to alienate that peer of yours, and certainly not wanting to infringe on the social life of your own kids, but parents who are maybe a little bit over involved in their child's social life and therefore your child's social life? Any thoughts about that?
My initial thought is to approach it with curiosity with the other parent. And just because there could be multiple reasons why there could be a concern that you're not aware of, or they could have a concern that maybe is out of proportion, but is valid for them, right? And like having that conversation with that parent out of curiosity versus out of defense of your child or sort of the overstepping thought of, and recognizing you're the parent of your child. And so sometimes there's really hard decisions because not everybody parents their child the same way, right? Like this is a huge one with social media, with younger adolescents, of some limits are looser, some are not, and you don't have to change your parenting because it doesn't fit peer groups parenting. But I would say, I think my initial thought, without like really thinking through it deeply, would be to approach it with curiosity, because there could be reasons that the two of you as parents can work through or, figure out what is driving this sort of over functioning in the parenting role.
One thing that might be able to help with that, sort of the curiosity approach, is to assume positive intentions.
Yeah.
I think, and just sort of go in, like you were saying, like having a conversation about it. And part of a way of sort of holding off on maybe the negative aspects of what's happening is to just focus on the facts, focus on what's actually happening, what you're actually seeing, and just kind of having a conversation around those things, as opposed to applying like your thoughts or opinions about it. It can get there, but to maybe start just saying, I'm just noticing XYZ and just kind of curious about that, and they could say, oh, anything, it could be something that could be like, my child's gotten into this and I just need to keep a closer eye on them. So it just looks like I'm really involved. It could be anything, but I would say approach it with that positive intent.
And the two of you are both navigating a really difficult thing right now, being parents of adolescents, right? And so you already have that in common. And so you could even start with like, I get it, like this is not an easy thing to do. And so, pairing that with the curiosity and assuming positive intentions could help the conversation go in a totally different direction than if it was just, hey, stop infringing on my child's life.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Do you have any particular advice for students who are getting ready to make a change? Whether they're graduating from high school or middle school, or just, or their family's moving, or they're starting a new school, or they're just, going from one grade to the next. Any advice for students who are anticipating that time of change and how to, experience the celebration, but also the uncertainties of those transitions?
I would say to focus on the accomplishments and what is there. I think it sort of depends on why that student might be changing schools, or what kind of how they're feeling about it. But going back to meeting the student where they are. But if we're assuming that let's say it's a graduation, they're leaving their school and going on to career or college or military or what have you. And just really sort of acknowledging that it's not a this or that feeling, they're both. They're connected. You can be thrilled and happy and excited, and you can be sad, and you can be, even feel some grief around it. So I think allowing them to know that it's perfectly fine to feel what seems like very conflicting emotions around something, and understand that it is a part of what can happen in our life experience. And then from there, being able to embrace the wonderful things that you want to embrace and remember and hold on to, and then also sort of paying some attention to those things that are maybe worries or concerns that they may have.
Yeah, I'm so glad you pointed out that the dialectic there of the both and, right? Like two opposing things can be true at the same time, and noticing when you or your child is getting polarized on either side of that pole, of overly excited and ignoring that this is anxiety provoking, right, for anyone, or really focusing on too much on the anxiety and the catastrophizing side and missing the accomplishment and everything that's positive around it. So really, for yourself and for your child, holding space for both of those things to be true and to navigate both of those things simultaneously.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. I have learned a lot about the dialectic, and I believe really strongly in the power of acknowledging that more than one thing is true at the same time. That's been helpful for me as an adult human, trying to parent some human teenagers. So I appreciate you reiterating that. We're getting close to the end of the hour, and I wanted to make sure that we One, remind folks that if they have, anyone who's registered for this event will get a copy of the recording if they haven't been able to tune in the whole time. And Sylvette and Kim have been kind enough to put together some resources for us that we're going to share out along with that recording, which will come out hopefully tomorrow. I started to say before the end of the week, and I realized that's actually tomorrow. So we'll try and put that together. We're grateful for the chance to engage in these conversations and to recognize the importance of talking about mental health. Health is health, and it's important for us as human beings to be available to support one another and to learn as much as we can about how to navigate these waters. So as we get ready to wrap up, I wanted to ask each of you about your best advice for helping parents navigate the treacherous waters and the challenges that come with the tween and teen years. So as you are in that space as a parent, there are difficult conversations to be had. There are tough moments to kind of work through as a family. And some parents might want to solve the problem first. And, that isn't, it's coming from a place of love and a desire to help, but it isn't always the thing that helps build an adult, which is our job, I think, as parents and schools. So I wonder if each of you could share a little bit of your advice for us as we attempt this brave endeavor.
I would say first and foremost, you're human before you are a parent, and we are all fallible, and that to really lean into the emotional experience of your child first before jumping into problem solving, because your problem solving will look differently once you acknowledge and understand and get to know the emotional experience that they're feeling, whether it's accurate for the facts or not. It's their perception is their reality in that moment. So, but first and foremost, you're human. You're more human than you are a parent. And so that is, you don't have all the answers, and you're fallible. We all are. Okay. 30-second pitch.
Yeah, mine is, I was like, okay, I have many, but I would always say that always know kind of where you are in terms of your level of stress, where you are emotionally, what your thoughts and fears are, and just make sure that you have some clarity around that, because I think it's important. It'll help you you'll either have the fuel to move forward with having the conversation or delving into the issue, or you're going to be operating off fumes. And so it's important that if you know, oh, I'm really tired, or really I'm super stressed, or I'm dealing with a lot of anxiety, or I've dropped so many balls and this is just not one I can afford to drop on top of what's already happening, just know that it might need to wait until you're at a place where you can have the conversation or deal with the problem. And so I would say just make sure that you are taking care of yourself while you're also taking care of your child or your children, to make sure that you're taking care of yourself as well, and to do the things that you need to do to be able to have the fuel that you need to propel and do what you need to do as a parent.
And as you navigate it, recognizing things change. Like I just thought of when you said about the balls of looking at like what in your life are glass balls versus plastic balls. And so if the plastic balls drop, that's okay. And so really looking at, and what a glass ball today, next year or in 6 months may be a plastic ball. And so just giving yourself a little bit of grace and permission to not have a house full of glass balls.
Keeping with that ball symbolism, I often tell students, sometimes you feel like you're juggling so many balls, and it's actually empowering to decide that you're going to put a ball down so that you don't drop it. You decide, okay, this is the ball I can't deal with, I'm putting it down. And it just feels much better as a student or a parent to be able to say, I decided to put this on the back burner, as opposed to I dropped it and now it's broken and I have to deal with the damage. So just know that you can put a ball down, you can put that on the back burner and it can wait. And just know that that's also an option.
Thank you so much. I love the power of choice, right? I think we feel the most
Mhm.
stressed when we feel like our lives or any situation is out of control, and recognizing that we have choices at all times, and that we can make a choice and move forward from there is empowering. It's a gift that I know each of you have given to truly hundreds, if not thousands of students at this point. And I'm grateful for the good work that you do with the students who are lucky enough to work with each of you. And I'm glad that we could share your ideas and advice and inspiration with a larger audience today. If we can be of help to you at Appleruth, we're glad to do that. If you want to reach out to Kim or Sylvette personally, I know they'd be glad to answer questions.
Absolutely.
And as I say, are going to share some terrific resources as part of our follow-up tomorrow. So thank you all for joining us, and we wish you all the best with the many celebrations and excitement that May can bring.
Thank you.
Thank you.